So let's get to our presenters today. We're joined by one of our senior researchers here at NLI who has been essential to our allyship work and is deeply knowledgeable on the relevant science and research when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, Michaela Simpson. Hi, Michaela. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, Gabe. I am here. Can somebody make sure my camera can get on? Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Yes, I'm sure we can change that permission for you. I hope we can see your face.
There you go.
There
Hello,
you
everybody.
are.
Sorry about that little
better.
snafu. Great to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Michaela. And our second presenter today is one of our senior consultants and facilitators here at NLI. She delivers to a wide variety of clients our work around growth mindset, inclusion, bias, and much more. Janine Stewart. Janine, are you there? Okay, yours worked. That's good.
I am. Hello. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Welcome. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to you, Janine, to get us started.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gabe. And hello, everyone. It's wonderful that you have chosen to spend some time with us today to talk about how to scale a culture of allyship. My colleague, Michaela Simpson, and I are going to talk through this content with you. We've done a lot of work together designing this program, and it really is a nice adjunct to the other work that we do supporting organizations globally in becoming more inclusive. So just a note as we get underway. You may want to prepare to use your chat window. Many of you are doing that successfully now, but I'll note as you answered Gabe's initial question about where you're located, notice whether you have that blue oval set to panelists or panelists and attendees. We'd love for others on the line to be able to see what you entered. And so use the pull down now to select panelists and attendees, and you'll be able to share your thoughts with everyone. So thanks for those who have taken care of that. So the concept of allyship is one that's still novel for a lot of us, at least in terms of how we might talk about this in the workplace and how we might talk about it in a way that would really support behavior change for our organizations and the good people who want to become better allies. So we have some prompts to share initially in order to get us thinking about situations where someone could use their position of relative advantage to offer support to someone who's being left out or marginalized. So Gabe, we'll take a look at the next slide. Let's see if this sounds familiar to you. Example number one, consider where you have a team meeting, a walking meeting that's scheduled, but you know one of the attendees uses a wheelchair. There's one opportunity for allyship to come in. Next slide is another. Your male coworker is auditing a call where a female leader is presenting. The client defers to the man on the call instead of the woman presenting. There's an opportunity for allyship. And the third example, you overhear your one coworker say to another, "Well, you must be the new diversity hire. Welcome to the team." There's another example where allyship could come in. And actually, Michaela, I'm going to invite you to just join me on audio now if you're free to do so. Let's make sure that we're able to click back and forth.
Yes, man, I am on video, but I forgot to unmute myself.
There we go. Perfect.
Yes, thanks.
So just wonder if we could maybe invite the audience to expand on this.
Right. Yeah, I was really curious, or we're actually really curious to know whether those of you who are online with us, have you seen similar situations to this, the ones we just described? What have you experienced? So if you could share in the chat, that would be fabulous. And we could see what's coming up for people. So yeah, Janine just shared some examples. And yeah, somebody said, well-intentioned, but not so great examples. So I'll let our team kind of see some things. I know one that is this kind of generalized one where somebody might have an interesting name or look a certain way and they're asked, "Oh, where are you from?" "I'm from New York." No, where are you really from? You know, comments like those of not, believing that you are actually from where you are, which is somewhere in the US. Gabe, are you seeing some of these comments that are coming up?
Yep, boy, they're really streaming in. It's a nice big crowd today.
Yes.
I think not so funny jokes, something as simple as that. Diversity committees formed with no BIPOC members. I think, yeah, that's something we've heard a lot in former sessions that we've run on this. Another one that's very common, deferring to an older man.
Right.
Some
Or I
sort of
just, yeah,
legacy traditions.
and I just saw one. I've also experienced Black people being complimented for, "You're so articulate."
Just saw that.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Or you talk in a professional tone. I'm an African American, says the writer. So, so we have a lot of examples of opportunity. All right. And what we want to do is get clear on a definition of allyship. How should we be thinking about this concept so that we can start to dig into how we might change it up? How might we behave with one another in order to do better? And so the next slide offers a definition that we all can use. It's when someone is aware of and uses their advantaged position to actively support people in less advantaged positions. So there's a definition we can use. Now, admittedly, this is a simple definition, but it's a multi-layered concept. And it's a complex set of behaviors and strategies we're going to need to work with if we're going to figure out how to get this right. Now, organizations like yours, I'm sure on the line today, have been working for many years to try to get this right, to try to create formal opportunities to support underrepresented groups. And on the next slide, I've kind of got a range of those kinds of opportunities represented, so we can acknowledge that these fit into some different categories, and then let's figure out where allyship can come in. First, in the blue box, I've got some opportunities we create to connect with one another, to relate well to one another, that are less formal, friendship, being a peer, being a supportive peer, and those aren't necessarily related to advantage, right? We may be peers at work just because of where we are in our career progression. Not because someone has said, hey, you're special and we're going to promote you or put you in a position of advantage. So let's look at that red box and think about what we mean by advantage. In the workplace, advantage can come from earned statuses like being promoted, being higher up in the hierarchy. As people rise in the hierarchy, they're often tapped to be mentors or sponsors. And those can be part of formal or informal arrangements within different workplaces. Now, allyship is related to advantage, but it doesn't have to be formal. So being an ally actually means that you have taken stock of your situation, recognize that you do have some advantage in a given situation, and when the moment arises, you extend yourself to support those who are in less advantaged positions. So let's move forward to the next slide and go a little deeper into this concept. So with allyship, no experience is needed. No formal position or authority is needed. It can be quite simple. And it can involve a simple decision in the moment if we're just prepared to lean in when the opportunity arises. So allies support individuals and groups, and they can do so without coming from a place of direct experience. It's about being prepared to recognize the moment and having done a bit of self-reflection about how we want to show up in support of others. So a simple vignette might be useful to help us distinguish the role of an ally from the role of something more formal, or more easily defined, perhaps, like a mentor or a sponsor. And Gabe, I know you have a vignette that I think is a great example of what we mean by true allyship in the moment.
Thanks, Janine. Yeah, I do. I produce our podcast, Your Brain at Work, and I sort of stumbled onto this story. I think a lot of people, especially well-meaning white men in advantage positions, don't know where to start, either inside an organization or just in their daily lives. So this podcast episode is a great example of that, proving that it's really not that hard to do. So one night last summer, and I'll make this quick, my brother, Josh Berzin, told me this story about a chance encounter he had with an Uber driver, a young man of color named Kendrick Trotter. They had one of those Uber conversations where two people kind of organically take an interest in each other's well-being, and the conversation starts to really flow. And Kendrick was taking Josh to a house in San Francisco that Josh was looking to buy. Kendrick noticed Josh, okay, here's a guy making a good living. So they start having kind of an impromptu career conversation. And Kendrick, in his words at that time, told Josh he wanted to become a millionaire. He was a football player in high school and in college, but he got hurt. He had tons of energy and drive, but he wasn't sure where to start. So Josh suggests that Kendrick get into software sales, telling him, hey, you don't really need experience. You already have the ambition and the intelligence, and many companies are eager to find minority talent. So this starts a now 3-year relationship. And in the end, Kendrick got a fantastic job, not the end, but as you know, that's where he is now. He continues to grow. So he has this great job at a company called Radware. His career is really blossoming. And what's so great about it, at least for me, is that it illustrates how helping others, or what academics would call pro-social behavior, is really the greatest, longest acting drug high you can get. It's an endless supply of dopamine hits. And that behavior really went viral. That same instinct to help seemed to take hold in Kendrick. And he also felt the need to pay it forward. So he started a training program to mentor young people in minority communities to prepare them for the workforce in high-tech sales. It's called Us in Technology. I believe someone may be sharing a link there where you can look at that on LinkedIn. In that other picture in the former slide, you can see Kendrick leading a training, and in his intro, he always refers to Josh as the inspiration for his work. So it's just been a wonderful story to share and a great example of being the change you want to see in the world. So we'll share a link to that podcast episode also in the chat if you want to, on your own time, have a listen. It's really great to hear them both tell this story. And with that, Janine, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Gabe. I think that's a great example. And you also shared, just in passing, a little phrase that I want to call out because it links to the science behind our approach. You mentioned dopamine hits. Dopamine is a brain chemical that is part of our brain's reward system. There are many things in our social interactions that can trigger positive experience and that feeling of well-being and reward that goes with it. And I want to connect that very intentionally to the question, and actually Liz in the chat a little while back, a few inches back, had said it's a big if to say when people are aware. So being aware of that moment for allyship is critical, and it's part of what we want to emphasize via this program. In order for people to have clear access to those moments that are going to be rewarding for them. It's rewarding for any of us to recognize that we have a moment of opportunity to give back, pay it forward, or just share expertise, wisdom, or position. So really this is about helping people to connect with that awareness, and that means that we need to shape our own frameworks in the workplace in order to support this learning and awareness. So let's come back to that. Why is this important in the workplace? The next slide, thank you. There are so many benefits of a diverse organization. Billions of dollars have been spent, we're all aware of this, billions of dollars spent over many years toward traditional DE&I efforts. And unfortunately, a lack of representation persists. This is a bit of a puzzle, but we've got some data that we want to share. We see this as a global challenge, but we'll start off with some data in the US that help us to understand how far we have to go. On the next slide. In the US, we know that only 1% or 5 of the Fortune 500 CEOs are Black. We know that about 7.4%, that's 37, Fortune 500 CEOs are women, and 0.8% or 4 Fortune 500 CEOs are openly LGBTQ. Now, we know it's a global problem. In one data set or some points I'll share come from the UK, one source of information. So we'll fill that in with one more click. Thank you. In the UK, we know about 20% fewer BAME members in the legislature post-Brexit than before. There are 4.67% or 28 of the Stocks Europe 600 CEOs who are women. And in a survey, workplace discrimination is perceived to have risen from 2012 to 2019. So there's still a great deal of work to do. We've increased people's ability to talk about issues of D&I. We're not yet achieving what we would like to be achieving in terms of full representation at the senior levels. So business executives that I have spoken with over the years often comment that it's just really hard to find people who would better represent the full diversity of the population in our senior leadership. And the next slide includes a graphic that helps to explain why I say that's simply not true. We need to reframe and understand that there is broad diversity, broad representation in our pipeline of potential hires for executive level positions. The data are clear. The diverse talent that we seek is with us at the early levels, the early stages of career, but we lose this richness as people progress through their career. So we have a representation problem at the top, in part because of a lack of allyship along the way. As the next slide summarizes, despite billions of dollars invested and documented benefits of increased diversity, we're not where we need to be. Clearly, we need to do better. And again, we're still at the beginning stages of really understanding what does this look like when it works well. And Michaela, I know you have a great story that you brought forward, and we're going to turn to that next. A public story that demonstrates the difference allyship can make. And I know the next slide has a graphic for that.
Great. Thank you, Janine. Yes, I'd like to share with you an example of allyship in action. And this example features a woman named Effie Brown, who in 2015 appeared on the HBO reality show, Project Greenlight, where first-time directors compete to get their films made. And the show was produced by Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. And so on the show, Miss Brown, she urged Matt Damon and the other judges to select a diverse directing team for one of the films that was being made. And she pointed out that the only Black cast member played a sex worker who was beaten or who was hit by her white male, let's call him manager. And Matt Damon dismissed her call for more representation of color behind the camera. And he said, when we're talking about diversity, you do it in the casting of the film, not in the casting of the show. And later in the episode, Matt Damon suggested that, diversity shouldn't even be an issue when you're considering the filmmaking team. He said, I think the whole point of this thing is that you go for the best director, period. Now, granted, he did later apologize for his comments. But what happened is Miss Brown, after speaking up to Matt Damon, she said she struggled to get work for a really long time after the incident. She said, after I did Project Greenlight, I suffered a huge backlash. I didn't work for a while. People didn't want to work with me because I spoke truth to power. She eventually came back, mainly because a very well-known and successful screenwriter, director and producer Lee Daniels wanted to work with her, wanted to hire her for one of his projects. However, there was a roadblock because the studio, knowing her reputation, they were hesitant to give her the green light. But Lee Daniels went to bat for her. He advocated for her, and she was able to get that job. And then, she was able to kind of come back into the business. But she said, that's what needs to happen. You need someone with power and the courage of their conviction to help. That's what Lee did. So this is one of the ways that allyship can make a difference. And so let's think about it. So how does allyship fit into the bigger picture of diversity and inclusion when we think of organizations? And so if we can advance to the next slide, we'll talk more about that. So, basically diversity is about numbers and representation. But when people don't feel included and that they belong, they leave. So with diversity, the numbers might stay the same. In fact, the numbers might even increase, but the people may not be the same. So right now, we have more energy now than ever to increase inclusion and belonging in organizations. And we believe that we can harness that energy with allyship, which is a skill set. And so before I delve more into how we can engage in allyship as individuals, I'd like to talk about what gets in the way of allyship. And I'm going to do it from the perspective of science. And basically, what does research tell us about human behavior? And just to step back just for a minute, let's go back to like the concept of allyship to begin with. At its core, allyship is about working toward achieving equity. And while equality assumes that everyone basically kind of starts off at the same level, everyone has the same access to opportunities and advantages, equity acknowledges that that's not the case, that people have different lived experiences, that some people might need a bigger leg up than other people because they started from a more disadvantaged position. So what equity does is it distributes resources and opportunities accordingly to achieve equal results. So where each individual is given what they need to succeed. And I keep on doing this because I think of, equal and unequal relationships. And if we think about unequal situations, we'll notice that one group will have an advantage over another group. And social scientists call that phenomenon advantaged inequality, right? So when you have inequality, you have some at an advantage and some at a disadvantage. So oftentimes people who have an advantage in a particular context, they don't realize their advantage. They're just living their lives. And this is often because people who have advantage in particular contexts, they tend to control valued resources. And this is in part fueled by observed group behavior that scientists refer to as social dominance. So social dominance theory, it posits that in stable societies, you'll have groups that form. You'll have these group hierarchies in which some groups are more dominant than other groups. And then these dominant groups tend to create these group-based hierarchies or these group-based inequalities in which they're the ones on top. And among other things is that these dominant groups is they often get the overwhelming and final say on how valuable resources are distributed. So valuable resources such as information and money. So they get to decide how that's allocated. And by the way, that's one of the definitions of power, the asymmetric control over valued resources. So basically, you have members from advantaged groups. They might not distribute resources equally. So they'll have a tendency to keep resources within the confines of their own advantaged group. And they also tend to create myths that legitimize their dominance and that justify institutionalized inequalities. So for example, it's not uncommon for people who in advantaged positions to think that, hey, the system is fair. They worked hard for what they had. And, so where their advantage is justified and it's legitimate. Whereas they might perceive those in a disadvantaged position to basically deserve their misfortune because maybe they're lazy or they just didn't work hard enough. And so therefore their disadvantage is legitimate and justified. And so you have this system that keeps on getting perpetuated. So to be allies, we have to recognize that advantage and disadvantage are real and that we can use our advantage to create more equitable relationships and work environments. So I just gave you a lot of information. So let's take a moment to pause and address any questions that are coming up.
Thanks, Janine. I sort of planted that idea in the chat to see if people wanted any kind of points of clarity on the stuff we've covered so far. There's quite a lot that you guys have unpacked. Just seeing a couple comments that people really enjoyed that definition of power. Thanks for that. I think there are a couple coming through. Oh, it sounds like someone actually wants you to repeat that definition. Would you be able to do that for us?
Oh, which definition of power?
Yes.
Yes, it's the asymmetric control over valuable resources. And however you want to consider valuable resources, but in our culture it tends to be money, information, and fill in the blank any number of other things.
Hiring decisions, promotion.
Yeah, well, yeah, when we want to get more granular, yes, exactly. And again, information, access to people who have power and information and the ability to give away resources.
And Michaela, while you're clarifying some definitions, Dan had asked earlier, does advocacy equal allyship? Can you help us sort out those two things? Which I think is a really helpful question from the original definition we posed of allyship.
Right, and I think I'm looking at ours. Our definition. So yeah, I know it depends on what field you are in, because some will make a very clear distinction between advocacy and allyship, and others will also put the two together. So I think it really comes from what your perspective is where, like in the social justice field where you're coming from. And sometimes we use the term very generally advocacy in terms of, hey, I'm, in a very kind of informal term, I'm advocating for my coworker here. So, I definitely want to acknowledge that those who might be deep in social justice work and where advocacy has like a deeper meaning, if you will. So I will leave it at that for right now. And
Very
I'm just seeing
helpful.
Thanks,
some of the
Michaela.
other. Mhm.
Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Janine. I have noticed this question come up a lot, and I think it's an important one to address here. Donna asks how to be an ally without the other person feeling like a victim who needs saving. It sort of probably speaks to white saviorism.
Right. And one of the things we say very later on is, yeah, don't assume that you are right or that you know everything. And one of the things we say, if you're working with coworkers, ask them, like, how can you be an ally for them? Don't just assume. Have that conversation, and it might be a little bit uncomfortable for some people, but have that conversation to have open up those lines of communication. It's just
Yeah,
also
how can
showing
I help?
respect. Yes.
I think that's big, because the thing that I've seen a lot in the chat is despite best intentions, and I think people do have good intentions. They just don't always know how to do it right. And I think that's such a great answer, which is, you know what, when in doubt, ask.
Exactly.
We're also going to expand in a moment on specifically what does one do? How do we exhibit the behaviors that really drive improvements in this area? One of the things you'll notice is just building on that notion of Michaela's response, that it depends a bit on the setting that you're in and the framing that your organization has for working with these concepts. We're taking a broad view to start this conversation. So we've got some examples we can share, and we'll build this into the conversation about behaviors and habits in a moment. We've got examples we'll share that are minuscule, what's the micro level behavior that you can exhibit, and some more macro shifts that you could drive from whatever position you hold.
Right. Yes. And so shall we take this as an opportunity then to move more into the granular?
Great.
All right, so now we've covered what allyship is, why it's important. We've also covered some of the science and what gets in the way of allyship. So, how do we create a culture of allyship in an organization? And at NLI, culture is defined by the everyday habits of its people. So we talk a lot in terms of habits. And we've identified 3 essential habits. Doesn't mean these are the only ones, but we've identified 3 essential habits that are built into our product called Ally. And this is a product you can scale at an organization of any size in a matter of weeks. So, let's dig right in. I'll just give you an overview of our 3 habits that we think better enable us to act as allies. And those 3 habits are identify inequity, increase equity, and drive change. So let's start with identify inequity. So again, going back to that inequality, when we think of inequality, we tend to think about the person who has the short end of the stick, right? We often don't think about the person on the advantage side. And this person may not even be aware that they have advantage. And as I said before, science shows us that if we have more advantage in a situation, that could be access to an elite education, access to influential people, we're more likely to distribute those resources to people who are in our own group, who are similar to us. So for us to be able to do something differently, we need to first recognize that we have advantage and where we have advantage, because we all have advantage in different situations and in different contexts. So identifying inequity is about recognizing the impact of injustice and unfairness. It's about doing your own work, educating yourself, listening deeply. It's understanding that inequality and inequity exist and identifying situations where you're in an advantaged position and where you're not. And so here I'd like to talk more about the behaviors that you can use to identify inequity, which are educate yourself, embrace discomfort, and label advantage. So educate yourself, read. You can read books, you can read blogs, you can watch webinars, watch films, have frank and vulnerable discussions with people. We just spoke about that earlier with your coworkers. Go to them and ask them, like, how can I be an ally? What's going on? How can I serve? Be proactive in finding constructive ways you could serve as an ally. embrace discomfort. Along our journey to become better allies, we'll likely find times when we feel uncomfortable and challenged as we learn about others' lived experience and come to terms with the benefits we've received in life due to our advantaged positions. Benefits we might not have been aware of or we just took for granted. And again, I want to assert that we all, in different ways, in some aspects of ourselves, have advantage, and sometimes we have disadvantage. And although it's understandable and normal to feel a range of emotional discomfort around this whole thing, whether it's guilt or fear that the status we've held for years might be reduced if other people attain increased status, it's still possible to work through our emotions and our discomfort and persist. Moving on to label advantage. Advantage changes depending on context and situation. So it can be based on attributes. I'm gonna give you this long list that you all know, gender, race, age, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, educational background, immigration status, religion, weight, physical attractiveness, physical ability, and a whole slew of other attributes. So we tend to think in the big ones, but they're all, race and gender. They're many, many aspects of ourselves that grant us advantage in some situations and not so much in other situations. And so given that we all have these attributes, it's possible for, like I said, for an individual to have presentations of attributes that put them in an advantaged position in certain situations. For example, male, Harvard educated, from a wealthy family. And it's also possible for that same person to have presentations of other attributes that put them in an advantaged position in another situation. For example, Jewish, Black, and gay. So whether in the workplace or during activities of daily life, we can pay attention and observe when we find ourselves benefiting because aspects of ourselves place us in an advantaged position. So we can do the same when observing others. And again, this is not meant to blame or shame. This is to remind ourselves, is to encourage ourselves that we can leverage our advantage to support others who are in a less advantaged position. So as I say all of this, Janine, what's coming up for you?
Just a couple of things. One is it's really helpful to point out here or to underscore your comment about that list of categories of advantage. Realize that regardless of your intersectional identities, there are times when you have the advantage in a group, in a decision-making setting, in a social environment. And allyship is a practice. It's a practice of recognizing, self-reflecting and recognizing what do I have to offer in this moment, and also being aware of enough of others to recognize when there might be an opportunity for allyship, for reaching out, lifting up, and elevating others. So the intent of our approach is to empower everyone to think about themselves as part of a system of allyship, a place where any one of us can identify an opportunity and feel confident that we are doing our best in the moment and know how to continue learning to do better. So I like that we're offering this emphasis on some specific behaviors to think about so that we can be confident that we know what to do in order to do better, even if we are imperfect as we make that learning journey.
Right. Thank you so much, Janine. I'm going to move us on to our next habit, which is increase equity. And this second habit is where we start putting allyship into action with increase equity. And increase equity is about considering the impact on justice and equity in your organization with each decision you make. So what are the ways you can go about doing this? So we'll talk about the behaviors. So the behaviors, as we can see on the next slide, are speak up, amplify voices, extend equitable opportunities. So with speaking up, I like to make a distinction. Speaking up or speaking out, they're not the same as speaking over. And it's important to note that speaking up from a position of power is safer. So people in disadvantaged positions can face more backlash for speaking up, as we gave the example of Effie Brown, and she was by no means the first person to experience something like that. And studies have actually shown that speaking up about one's own disadvantaged position is associated with lower ratings of competence and performance in the workplace. So as a person who has more advantage in a particular situation, it's important to make sure you're speaking up in a way that your colleagues in the less advantaged position would like. So ask them. And if you're among similarly advantaged similarly advantaged people, say in a room, and they make disparaging comments about coworkers who don't hold the same advantage as the people in the room, then speak up, say something. There are many different ways in which you can speak up. We also need to acknowledge power dynamics, because you still might be in an advantaged position in one aspect at work, and you want to speak up in support of a coworker who is in a less advantaged position, but the person you want to speak up to is a higher status than you. And so you might get silenced out of fear. So we just want to acknowledge power dynamics as well. I'd like to move on to amplify voices. That's about leveraging your voice so that the voices of those in less advantaged positions can be heard. And some people brought that up much earlier on, like now it's probably a foot long ago in that chat. And I want to say it might've been Kristen Wilcox. She talked about this phenomenon, and some people might be very familiar with this where they've witnessed it or it's happened to them. And some people on the line, this might be new what I'm describing. But it is not uncommon at the conference table for the voices of women, the voices of people of color, and the voices of women who are people of color, for their voices not to be heard. So they might say something at a table full of people and it goes completely unacknowledged and ignored. And then a few minutes later, a white person or a man says the exact same thing. And everybody's like, oh my goodness, that's such a great idea. So rather than calling that out, what we can do for voice amplification is to say, I agree what Janine just actually said there, kind of expound on that, or say, I want to make note that Janine just suggested that. And that's a way to amplify the voices and for people to become aware without alienating and calling out those who've engaged in that behavior where they've ignored the voices of others. So another behavior we can engage in to increase equity is to extend equitable opportunities. So if you find yourself in situations where you can extend equitable opportunities, do so. So these types of actions counteract what people in advantaged groups tend to do, which is keeping the resources and opportunities within their own advantaged groups. So if you're on a hiring panel or an interview panel and you find that your team consistently extends offers only to people who are similar to them because they went to the same university, they're from the same hometown, they belong to the same racquetball club, say something and advocate for people who are in less advantaged positions. So I've already said a lot. Janine, what's coming up for you in this moment?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm really anchoring on, I've been watching the chat and I see a lot of questions go to those big, we can't do this kinds of issues, like it's too big, culture change is too big. So let's bring it back down. One of the things I like about your list here is that it brings us back down to the smallest actionable steps we can take to drive culture change from wherever we are. So for example, I just want to highlight the really great suggestion about amplifying voices. And this is something I used recently in a meeting that I was not leading, where I had a colleague, a woman of color, who made a comment. And I don't know whether she would have been talked over. I didn't wait to find out. I interjected when she was finished with, I just heard my colleague's comment and I agree with it. It just created a pause. I didn't replace any of her words with mine. I just underscored. I heard her and I agree. And so everyone at the table, the rest of us white at that moment, everyone at the table paused and took a breath and just anchored again on what my colleague had said. So it just added a little more space before others talked over. Several of you commented early on in the chat that we're all well-intentioned, or in my case, this was a team of people who were all well-intentioned. We don't realize we have biases that cause us to overlook or talk over sometimes. But as an ally, I watched for the moment, I spotted it, and I acted to amplify without replacing someone else's voice. Tiny, no power involved on my part. I didn't have power, I just had voice. And it makes a difference. So it's one small thing I chose to do that day.
Yes. And what you basically are doing, like you said, it's tiny, it's small, and you can do that and you can use your voice. And what that does, and you said people paused, and when people engage in that behavior, they start seeing that as something that's normal, right? So They don't necessarily have to know what's behind it, but then we start normalizing that behavior and we set norms. And when we set norms, that's a way to create a culture shift. So that's one example, that it doesn't always have to be top down to create culture shift. And I want to acknowledge Melissa's comment about what do you do when you need to speak up and the person has more status than you. We actually have another product called Voice that really talks about that, because it is something that's very real and people have to take those into consideration. I'd love to go into that deeper. We're really not going to have time here, but I just want to let you know we do have a lot of resources for that as well, which does also tie into allyship as well, or to ally. So I think I'm going to move us along. Thank you so much for your contributions, Janine. I'm going to move us on to our final habit, third habit, which is drive change. And so sometimes we act in allyship with others to support systems level change. So we just kind of talked about things that were more kind of individual driven. And so this is about more systems level change. We can think about it at the organizational level. So for example, coworkers can act collectively to advocate for an equitable and inclusive paid parental leave policy. So remember back in the day where it used to be maternity leave, which, the attribution of that, or, what was suggested is that you have to be female and you have to be the birth mother of a child to get, maternity leave if it was even offered in your company. But now we have companies, because people have banded together and act in an allyship. Sometimes you have companies that offer paid parental leave policies that include parents, however they identify, adoptive parents and foster parents, and parents through surrogacy. So that's just a small level, like on an organizational level, of where allyship can come into play. The behaviors that go along with driving change are align on a vision, challenge the systems, and follow through. So when we align on a vision, we're able to come together as a group, a team or a collective, to be able to articulate a shared goal. And it makes it much easier to pursue that goal. And there's a lot of interesting things that happen in the brain when we identify with people who are similar to this. This is like actually using collective for good. Excuse me. Challenge the systems. So challenging the status quo to change the systems. And systems provide a framework for inequalities to be institutionalized and perpetuated. And so when people from advantaged positions are involved, their voices are more likely to be heard when communicating with those higher up in organizations who make decisions. So, people who are also in advantaged positions. So there's power there. And follow through. We need to combine intention. Not just our great intentions, that's wonderful, but we have to combine our intentions with action. We need to couple our commitment with action. So action is really important in this. And to offer you some additional practical guidelines on how to be, or guidance rather, on how to be an effective ally, here are some do's and don'ts on the next slide for individuals. So, don't take credit for work that's not yours. Acknowledge others. Don't expect to be taught. Do your own research. That also means you can ask people, but just don't expect people to come to you and teach you. And view the desire for change. Don't view the desire for change as a personal attack. Instead, listen non-defensively. People are speaking from their own experience. Don't assume how others feel. Instead, believe underrepresented people, believe what they're telling you. And don't behave as if you know best. Right, that you're the savior. It's like, be aware of your implicit biases. It's kind of like humbling yourself. And don't self-victimize. It's really not about you. Instead recognize that systemic inequalities exist. And so Janine, we just talked about what allyship looks like on an individual level. Could you tell us more what it looks like at an organizational level?
I am resonating with something Jen just added to the chat. I'm going to build on it in terms of how you build out the organizational capacity. So I think this is a great point. Connecting a program like allyship and the behaviors that you're emphasizing, Michaela, for us, to strategies that are supported by work groups and teams to get feedback, engage in conversation, find out what's working. And fearless feedback is the one that Jen mentioned. We have a product called Improve that has helped large organizations do better with feedback at scale. And that is true. We don't do allyship in a vacuum. We've got to think about the context we're building if we're going to build this capacity across large organizations, larger groups. And so I think it's a great question. And I would just say, I would just caution us not to treat this as something that happens in isolation from all the other good things we're doing to try to build a more inclusive culture.
Right. Thank you. And yes, would you like to?
Let's actually push forward and talk about the organization a bit. Some of the things that we had identified before this conversation are on this slide, things where we get it wrong. And it's easy for us to spot when we get it wrong. Human brains are wired to go negative. We're wired to see the challenge. So some of the things that we have seen, lip service paid by corporate America. So a lot of the companies, or it may be that some of the companies expressing solidarity with diversity and inclusion and allyship initiatives have also contributed to systemic inequality in the past. And maybe they've targeted the Black community, for example, with unhealthy products and services, failed to hire and promote, et cetera. Marketing instead of action, another form of lip service. So some statements that we may see where a marketing team that was trying not to offend white customers and white employees came up with a less than ideal approach to driving action or growth in this area. Traditionally white succession pipelines, something we've identified earlier. And the lack of transparency in hiring and diversity metrics. So as we try to get conversations going about what improvement would look like, there's an inability to actually identify the metrics of where we are, which might not look very appealing for marketing purposes. But we need that information in order to really measure progress and success to understand what's working. So there are some companies that get it right. We've got a couple of examples on the next slide. For example, Kroger in the US, a major grocery store chain. They've done two things that are impressive and kind of point us in the right direction. They've intentionally connected this concept of allyship to their triple bottom line initiatives. They created a $5 million philanthropic fund that would be directed toward organizations that support the advancement of the Black community and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Kroger's African American Resource Group also created an allyship guide from awareness to advocacy to really help educate Kroger's community of associates, leaders, customers, and community partners on racism, injustice, and the actions that allies can take. So really going deep, really figuring out what's the language we can use to share a commitment to this objective. And Microsoft is another. Microsoft has been ahead of the game in terms of allyship for a number of years. They really prioritized allyship specifically, and actually have been working with us for quite some time, for a couple of years. They developed their own language around this concept as well. They're thought leaders in this space, and they've intentionally woven allyship into their culture and DE&I programming company-wide as well. So a number of ways that we've seen it work, and I'll just highlight again, we're all very good at seeing when it doesn't work. Before I speak further, Gabe, about some of the ways that NLI does connect the work on allyship with other work that we have brought to some top organizations, I wonder if you want to present a poll so that folks can share some of their intentions for working with us going forward. And Gabe, why don't you explain how that works?
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, for those of you that see that poll up there, should be all of you. Sometimes these can hide behind other windows you've got open. You can minimize those to ensure you see it. I know Janine is going to share a couple more things about how we can roll Ally out in organizations. So you can leave this up without choosing one of the options there, or you can minimize it, whatever you prefer. But just to leave this up, we'll keep this up for the remainder of the webinar. So back to you, Janine.
Thanks, Gabe. So let me go forward in the slide deck then, and I'll share with you some of the ways that we do connect this to other programming and help to build out cultural competencies across an entire organization at scale. The next slide gives us our first example of something we can do, which is a research briefing. Our research briefings are semi-custom interactive keynotes, typically, that engage this material in light of what is going on at your organization. So we link to your existing priorities and strategies, and we can tailor the research briefing to the needs, interests, capacities of the leadership team where you are. So those are typically an hour. We do them virtually. We've done them virtually for ages, and they're highly effective. In addition, we do education at scale in a couple of different ways. The next slide is an example, or gives a graphic example of something we call a hive. The hive is a highly interactive virtual experience. And again, we've been doing virtual for years. So our model with the hive program is to take a concept like allyship, break it into 3 modules and space those out, usually by about a week. So each module builds on the content of the previous module. We do this in groups of about 30 per cohort. And over the 3-week period, we're able to develop a conversation, shared language, and we offer guidance on how to put it into practice in between the sessions. So when we come back together for module 2 and for module 3, we're able to debrief, figure out what's working, answer questions. It becomes like a leadership laboratory. We also offer wonderful practice and sustainment tools and materials. Those are highly effective. They've been very popular. And finally, the third option that we have for delivery is something we call a DLS. It's a distributed learning system. And we do this sprint style, so this can really scale. The 3 module sprints tend to take up about 20 to 30 minutes of a learner's time, but they really emphasize positioning content that can be applied and acted upon very immediately. So it's a just-in-time short modules followed in week 4 by an interactive facilitated webinar. And we'll have about 100 people on those webinars. That tends to be about the max. But it really allows strong learning and application. And again, it gives organizations a way to position shared language and really give people the behavioral insights, the tools, so that they can act on the behaviors that will actively target the goals of the organization with regard to allyship or the other content areas that we offer. And the last slide I have shows us some ways that we sequence this. And this has come up in the chat a few times, that we have other programs. A lot of the questions you had about what about unconscious bias? What about things people don't realize they're doing? How can we bring voice into the picture? What about growth mindset, just to acknowledge and accept that this change is possible? We actually have separate programs that are built to come together in a nice package or sequence. We call these learning journeys. And I've got 2 examples here. The first one starts with a growth mindset product that we have called Grow, moves through an inclusion focused product called Include, then unconscious bias with Decide. And on that set of 3 content areas as a platform, we add Ally. Another way is below that, starting with unconscious bias, we go from Decide to Include to Voice to Ally. So a couple of ways that we can work with you. We have a team of consultants who can talk with you and your organization about how to make that work, because we all want this to be effective. That's really what we're going for. So let me throw it back to you, Gabe. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Janine. I know we have maybe 2 minutes before we wrap up with announcements. I know Michaela had a question she wanted to address.
Yes, I just saw something that had come a bit far back, and somebody had asked, is it possible, this is about amplifying voices, that if you do that, you could be perceived as belittling. Could it be perceived as belittling by the individual who made the comment? And the person said they're truly curious about that. And I just wanted to make note that there's something really powerful. And I have to say, I've experienced that, where I've said something, it was completely ignored. It's happened more than once. And where I've had coworkers who said, and I didn't ask them to do this, they said, actually, I want to make note that Michaela just said that, and I agree with her, and da 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 da. And I felt so seen and heard in that moment that, you know, it's not just me. It's like, is there something with the way I talk that nobody, that, you know, my voice is not heard, and to realize that somebody did hear me. And we actually, there is research on when people feel that they're being heard, what actually happens in the brain. So it's, you know, kind of that thing where we get that reward signal, and it's, and that it makes us feel really good, and that's what's signaled in those parts of our brain, and that also evokes a sense of connection with the other person. And so it is actually quite profound when and I can speak from experience, when I hear somebody, when I realize somebody's heard what I said.
Excellent. Thank you, Michaela. Yeah, it's a wonderful example to leave on, I think. I know we're just about out of time, but I just want to thank you both for your time and preparation. A lot of work goes into these, so thank you for that. We appreciate the clarity on how organizations can build the habits necessary to scale a culture of allyship. And thanks also to the NLI team in the background that makes this all seamless, and to all of you for attending and bringing your insights to light in the chat. Such an active chat today. So many of you seem so well educated in this and bringing new perspectives. It really means a lot to us. So we'd love to hear your feedback on today.